Hi, everybody. Tim Hughes here. I'm the co-founder and CEO of DLA Ignite. I've got with me today Marcus, and Marcus and I are going to talk about the disconnect between leadership and teams, amongst other things. Before we get into that, Marcus, tell us, everybody, where we can find you, and B, why you have skateboards behind you.
Yeah. Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me. I'm an old skateboarder, so that's some of my back history when I was much younger. Today, everything's a bit more painful in the joints, but it's nice memory. So those are 90s skateboarding reissues of some of the big skaters from back in the days, and some of the boards I was riding myself. And I thought, either a bookshelf or skateboards, and I ended up with skateboards. And it's a nice icebreaker. Myself. You can find me either on LinkedIn, so just Google me there and find me and send me a message, or go to thewickedcompany.com or thewickedcompany.com/podcast, because I have a podcast too.
Fantastic. And you've written a book, haven't you?
I did too, yeah. So before the podcast came out of the book, and the book is called The Wicked Company. So sort of it sets the scene for some of the ideas and methodologies and principles that I apply and help organizations with. And that was sort of the origin of the podcast, where me and my friend Troy Norcross we interview business book authors.
Yep.
And the business books are circling around wicked problems and team ops and leadership and team building and so on, and those modern processes and organizations that we so badly need. And so the book is a bit historical, yet gives advice on what to do. The podcast, a lot of smarter people than me talking about the similar kind of examples and how to apply those. And out of that is sort of wrapped up around the kind of work I do. So that's sort of me in a very, very small nutshell.
So you've got a background in design and tech, computer-related design, engineering, innovation. You've got a lot of background in design. So how did that get you to where you are today?
Yes.
Because you probably don't like me using this term, but you're a thought leader. You're creating leading thoughts. So how did that background get you to talk about the Wicked Company and run the podcast?
Yeah. It's a very good question, because a lot of people look at me and don't really know what to do with me sometimes, or are getting confused because there's so much different things going on. Thought leader, often opinion leader, I guess, more than that. However, so I originally started in design and tech around about the dot-com boom. So I did design and I coded at the same time, and that got me quickly into a lot of innovation projects. So I came to London 20 years ago from Germany to do an MA in something called computer-related design, later called design interactions, and we used the IDEO design thinking approach to produce innovative solutions for people with the help of technology. So that's sort of where the people, design thinking, tech mixture comes in, and the innovation drive. I did that for a few years and then realized that in organizations, the innovation has a very low failure rate, and a lot of companies try to newly do that who hadn't done innovation really before. So I got hired a lot to run innovation teams, and then saw that we built some, MVPs and had some business
minimal viable products. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then often these things didn't go anywhere afterwards, after we left or after the project was taken deeper into the company. So I got very interested into the context within which these ideas can grow. And before I knew it, I ended up in a more strategic role, looking at the end-to-end process of from idea all the way to live on the market and growing a product or service on the market, and building the context that can actually make those things happen. And a lot of organizations are not very up to modern times. So I ended up being in a lot of change and transformation as a business consultant.
Okay. And so in terms of what's your definition of design thinking? So if there's people out there that don't understand what it is, what do you mean by it?
Yeah. So for me, and I've seen varieties of that, so I'm not going to quote the sort of Stanford.
But you haven't about it, don't you, Marcus?
Yeah, exactly. So it's essentially a set of methodologies, principles, and tools in order to understand the problem better and then iteratively test solutions till you end up with the best possible at that time, given the knowledge you have, solution to put out there, which helps you with, exploring the context of a problem and de-risking what you're putting out live there, mainly. So that's sort of design thinking. So there's a lot of doing involved, and a lot of people get sometimes confused, like, oh, it's just thinking, and we're not doing anything. It's like, yes, we do. Actually, we do things very small and quick. So it's very iterative. That's essentially sort of design thinking in a very small nutshell.
And so how does that, when in your book, The Wicked Company, you talk about the factory system. Because I think a lot of people have been kind of talking about that over the last 2 years, because all of a sudden people have woken up and realized that they were on this treadmill of I commute to work, I go into an office, I do a day's work, I come back again, and then we're all working from home and go, do you know, that all that commuting into work seemed to be like a whole load of waste of time, to go into an office where I actually don't do any work because people keep disturbing me. So how did you come about with this, with the book, The Wicked Company?
So for quite a long time, I think it took me about 10 years across various industries to have this kind of feeling that there's something missing. The mindset isn't quite right. And it wasn't just the idea that, oh, maybe they're not using technology right. I think what was missing was the why are we using these new technologies as a company? Why isn't it redefining or amending the essence of what the company that adopts these new things originally stood for or had a purpose of? And I was quite struggling for a while to really put it into words, and eventually I sort of got there. And sort of one of the breakthrough moments for this thinking was I found a difference between what was described as a tame and a wicked problem. And a tame problem is this kind of linear thing that's very controlled. It's easy to gather enough information to, in a very controlled manner, solve a problem. And you solve it once, and then you can replicate it in different contexts, and it will still work. Good example, building a bridge. Once you know how to build a bridge, you can build a bridge any way you like. There's very different variations in it because the thing will just work. It's very, very different when you look at modern problems that have been occurring more and more and got more and more severe with the advent of internet technology, which is people problems, right? So people, when you bring them a solution, they don't just do that and then say, okay, I'll keep behaving the same way, I'll keep using it the same ways. No, we get something, we get used to it, we learn about it, and then we start using it differently, right? So we adapt. So the context adapts to the solution you throw it at. And when you have that context, it's a wicked problem, which means it's ever evolving, it's a moving target. And what I found is that organizations themselves, because they got more complex, and outside what customers are doing with the internet, with social media, with how we use modern services, they all started to have characteristics of wicked problems. But the organizations themselves are still structured in a way that they think it's a tame problem. So they have this linear thing, we throw a solution out once and it's solved. It's like, no, in a week's time, this already has changed. And they don't notice it, they don't measure it like that, they don't work towards it like that. And therefore, there's a lot of failure happening when trying to tackle these things. So that makes a lot of company structures very outdated. And that got me to the Wicked Company, which means Wicked Company is a company that can actually better solve wicked problems. And that requires a lot of new structures. So all the Agile thing, HR to process to including technology, but the way teams are spun up and act, the way leadership enables instead of just tells what to do. All these different things, all the stuff we see everywhere in every different aspect of the industry is starting to slowly happen because of these wicked problems. And I think I found a nice sort of wrapper of a name for this.
So so what you've done is that you've used your experience in design thinking, so the agile and iterative, looking at engineering type problems, but then what you're doing is that you're applying that to business, because business is, I don't know about you, but over the last 2 years since we've been in COVID, everything seems to change every 3 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where these design and iterative approaches are having a higher survival rate. So the engineering approach, as you just mentioned previously, works really well in these factory environments, because but the requirement for that is often quite tricky, right? So an engineer will only start working once they have all the information.
Yeah.
That will never happen in a wicked problem. So they're already at a loss and go, that's too high risk. I can't do this. I can't do that because I don't have enough information. Whereas a designer goes, okay, I'll have a look and I'll try a few things and I'll try a few things more and eventually something will stick. And that's a very different approach. So design and Agile have actually a similar approach, even so one comes from design, the other one from development. So it's actually interesting that they quite have a similar mindset. But that kind of iterative de-risking process is the one that has a chance to get into these wicked problems. And so the engineering is a bit at a loss, which has been identified back in the 60s, by the way, because the wicked problem is not my idea. It's some smart people back from the 60s identified that kind of problem and said, maybe the engineering and sometimes even the scientific approach is just not working in those kind of scenarios. We need a different approach. And I think that time has come.
Yes. And you know, I think was it the word of last year was pivot, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So everybody was pivoting, which meant, well, what we've done in the past and what we were trying to sell doesn't work anymore. So we need to find something else to work on. And I guess that's a wicked problem, isn't it? Because you don't actually know what to pivot to.
Exactly. So I think that's the really interesting aspect of, and what I see in a lot of organizations I work in. Some organizations just double down on the stuff they did before.
Yeah.
Ignoring the fact that, look, the map is just completely redrawn. The least you can do is start looking and coloring in that map, because you don't know what it is now. Yet some seem to believe, no, it's fine. We just sell harder and everything is fine. And they're going to have a very rude awakening. So the good ones started to really invest in exploring that map by having teams work differently, bringing research in, especially sort of in the first % of a project, which is a lot where I look at with the team ops approach, right? So I totally understand, or I think it's quite required, and you can read it in quite a couple of new leadership books, is that as a small group of leaders in a company, you cannot possibly have those understandings anymore, right? You can't just sit there and drop the map and drop the vision. It just doesn't quite work, because you're not enough people, you don't have enough time to explore it, right? It's world's too complex. So you have to start to enable differently so that actually the rest of your organization can have a good shot at trying to help you define the vision. And that's a big shift in governance, in who sets the vision, who says what the vision is, and it has to become more collaborative. Again, that's where sort of this gap between leadership and teams and the expectations between them is becoming quite critical, but often hasn't been addressed, right? Because it's still sort of a bit of a top-down approach, like, oh, well, that's what leadership wants, so we're not going to question and do so. And teams have to start being told that they can and start challenging those things, right? And that's where the pivot comes in. So one of the things I do with the team ops is to give people a checklist in the beginning. It's like, if you get a brief from someone, go through the checklist. One of those points is, am I allowed to pivot? And what scenario do we need in order to have a pivot? And I've been in transformation projects where, 3 out of 3 initial problems that were there, after 2-3 weeks of research, we came back with, hey, that isn't a problem, but we found another bigger problem. Can we pivot? And we pivoted all of them. So more likely than not, this will happen more and more. And if the teams don't have the flexibility, you're going to waste millions on the wrong thing. Just because no one in the team thinks they can speak up, or as leaders, you don't enable them to think that they can do, right? So that gap is really crucial, because it's going to decide to a significant amount if your future investments will actually make a difference. So it's a very interesting area to look at.
Yeah, can I take you back and say, so this thing about the disconnection between leadership and teams, and I think that we've seen it. It's been the whole thing is blown up because of COVID, because we're not sitting in the office and you can't sort of like go, so where's Steve?
Yeah.
He's taken 2 hours for lunch? That's not good, is it? Because of these things that we're not able to in effect shout at our people and tell them to do something because they're not in the office. So this whole thing about team ops, what's your definition of this of team ops?
So team ops for me is a a framework and a methodology or a set of principles and rituals to essentially enable leaders and teams to have a better start at a project. So I'm mainly looking at the first percent, because I consider that design thinking, service design, lean, agile, all these things are fairly fine further down the line, right? So once a project has kicked off and the team start running their sprints, be it research, design, whatever it is, then you're already beyond that initial 1%, that kind of sprint zero thing. And that's taken care of. Agile's there, design thinking is there. There's plenty of processes that do a really good job. The tricky thing is the first part, when actually between leadership and team, you want to make really, really clear that what is the actual problem we're working on here? Do we think that really is the problem? How sure are we? Do we understand it? So the communication there, for example, at the start is really, really crucial, because I've seen it just too often where teams don't quite understand it, then they go off, then expectations are made, so they need to produce something. And before you know it, not only are they producing the wrong thing or the wrong scope, they're also coming back or already working on it where they're not really buying into it because they don't really understand it or they disagree with it. And therefore, you're not going to get a lot of production out of them, right? And then they also don't speak up when there is actually a pivot. They just keep doing what they're doing. Before you know it, it's gone horribly, horribly wrong. Nobody's happy about it, leadership or team, and everyone's just suffering. And given that we're living in this COVID world where these things are really crucial to really produce something of value, and we have a whole wave of depression and burnout and fear in those companies. I mean, if you don't do that, you're going to set yourself up to run really, really bad processes, teams, and not produce any value in your organization that you really want to change. So it helps leaders understand that crucial piece of communication, being open to have question asked in the right way, sometimes tough questions, agree with teams on these pivot and other governance aspects rather than rigidly run with something. Because a lot of projects these days are quite different and people are still trying to figure out how this works. And, if I, for example, look at a big project I did over at the telco, we had like 14 teams there. Every team was running the process a little bit different. That was okay, as long as you in the beginning said, you know what, this feels a bit different. Do we agree? Yes, I think so. Well, we're gonna cut the corner here and accelerate a bit there, but this where we focus a bit more on. Great. So now we're all knowing what we're doing, and if something looks a bit different, we know why, right? Great. That's a great starting setup. And if you just don't get that, I think you're running a really high risk to just not catch back up with modern times or really fail even harder after a bad year that we had last year.
And I guess this is impacting on management, which is there's a requirement to empower, there's a requirement for trust, and a requirement for communication, and all of those things are important as part of the team ops culture, I guess.
Absolutely, especially now, as you mentioned, now that we're living in the era of Zoom, we have less communication, so the communication needs to raise in quality a bit. We might even end up to make meetings more effective because there's plenty of meetings people hate, people don't know what the purpose of it is, and just be clearer in these things. I mean, that just goes through the whole process, but in the beginning, these things are just more crucial. If I really, really understand what I'm here for, what my role is in the project, I'll perform so much better, and I won't have to ask somebody else because we already asked the question, so I can be more confident. I'm not lost after every meeting, and I will function much better. I'll be happier because I know what I'm doing, right? I think it's very crucial, and I think there is something of a standard level that needs to raise. And I'm not even starting talking now about the whole hybrid work where you have a mixture between, well, some people are going to be on the Zoom and others going to be in the room. How do you figure that out? Because the people in the room are going to talk a bit afterwards, whereas the people on the Zoom have shut down. So how do you bring that rest of the conversation back to the team and these things? Do you care? Can you? There's a lot of little things that will make things even more complex now, and I wonder how many organizations are understanding that at this point.
Yeah, I think the whole hybrid work thing is, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about it on paper, but there's a whole bunch of things that haven't really been ironed out in terms of how it's going to work. Because I agree with you. I mean, I've worked for tech companies, so it was pretty often that you would have people dialing into a meeting. But you're right. There's like the conversation that goes on before it. You have the meeting, and then there's the conversation that goes on afterwards. And the people that are remote can actually feel quite isolated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, I've now been for a year and a half mainly dialing into projects, not just projects, but basically brand new into new organizations I never worked before. And yeah, it's tough, right? There's a reason, I'm more tired, and a lot of people are more tired because that extra context you would normally get is not there. So you feel that lack of, and you struggle more. So you have to put more energy in. So therefore you're more tired. It's not just that we're having longer meeting. I think there's about statistically 10% more meetings, or a bit more like that. Some people sort of measured some of that. But it's also the fact that I think people are more lost. I have a harder time orientating myself within an organization that I'm thrown in. Normally it would take me about, let's say, 2 to 6 weeks to know who people are, where they sit, where they work, who they work with, and so on, what kind of meetings are being had. Because I see them moving about in groups, not just sitting on the desk. I know where the desk is. That's all gone. All I have is squares. And that makes it really, really hard. So I had to start really drawing up sort of more diagrams on my side to figure out who people are, and when I talk to them, these kind of things. And it's all extra effort. And I wonder, and I hope people will figure out a bit more how to contribute to that. Improving your onboarding and so on is surely a big part, or how your role is described and so on. And I'm currently working on a little prototype with a friend of mine to actually look at role descriptions in a bit of a different kind of light, that you can easier spin them up, bring them together, so people know a bit more of what they're doing and why, and what the actual skill requirement is, because that's a completely different conversation that seems to be shifting quite a lot as well.
Marcus, thank you so much for the conversation today. It's been fascinating in terms of the way that business is evolving. Remind people where they can get hold of you.
Yes, so just Google my name over on LinkedIn and just say hi, or go to thewickedcompany.com and you can get in contact there as well.
Fantastic. I've done a number of interviews with people around the future of work, and I just think it's going to change so much. And I always say at the end of these that we could have a conversation in 12 months' time, and it could be completely different.
Yeah, probably. I'm really curious how we're going to have picked this up when the big wave of burnout comes more to the surface, because it's already there, and you can already tell there's articles around people, even when they can, not willing to go back to work.
Yeah.
That's how dire it is. And I think there's a lot to be said about what they call psychological safety at work.
Yeah.
People feel not just that they feel safe to speak up or bring in their expertise, but actually to really go, what? Today I'm finishing at 4 because I've done my work and I have to go, and I don't have to feel bad about it, because that's all cool, right? And I don't have to worry about if I'm going to get fired because of this kind of stuff. These things really have to change, and I think they're going to be really tricky. I wonder if the organizations hopefully are going to realize that there's a massive amount of value in running your organization like that, not running it like a factory where you keep burning out people. Because there's so much more value in people that I've seen, where people have skills and things, just when you put them in the right context, they double their value. They're happier there. They enjoy, they stay longer at the companies. They're more likely to work there, And I've been to a lot of companies where they had a hard time getting new, smart, talented people in there, because they already knew that company doesn't have a great reputation.
Yeah.
So that's going to be even trickier for organizations to survive, to get the right talent. And it's always on the list of CEOs. How do you get talent? And well, start with that, create a better workplace. Don't just overmanage people, but acknowledge that, look, they're all professionals and they've done so for years. They're all grown-ups. They don't have to be whipped into place, right? But often that's oddly in some way in a structural organization, where often the case through some weird governance systems and ways of looking at how to manage people. And I think we're at the right time to hopefully improve that somehow, to create better organizations.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Indeed.
Marcus, thank you so much for today. I really appreciate it.
Lovely. Thank you, Tim.
Good to talk.
Nice being here.
Thanks, Marcus. Bye.